Hello and welcome to today's PSU Transportation Seminar. My name is Aaron Golub and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our PSU seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again being held live here on Portland State University's urban campus located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlawa bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and to honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we're excited to have Eric Bruun presenting the Green New Deal and Transit Investments. Eric Christian Bruun is the author of Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Towards a More Equitable Future, published by Routledge in 2022. He received his PhD in systems engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and has a broad knowledge base in engineering, math modeling, planning, applied to public transport, logistics, public investment analysis, and sustainable cities. And interestingly, he and I taught dueling courses, mine on bus, his on rail planning at the University of Cape Town for almost 10 years. But only today have we met in person, because the courses weren't offered at the same time. So it's fun to meet you. So here's a preview of some of our upcoming seminars. I'm not going to go through them all, but I do urge you to visit our website and learn more. As an overview for how today's seminars will go, you can expect our speaker to present for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. We will be receiving questions through the Q&A feature on your control panel, and we will ask them as best we can at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time for all your questions, we will give our speaker the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. We will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the slides. Eric, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hello everybody. And I'm very pleased to be in Portland State because as I was saying before you guys all came, there aren't that many programs left in the United States where you really can study transit engineering and transit planning in detail. As people retire, they're not replaced because there's so little research money, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So, how are we on that here?
A little bit of technical difficulties with my screen share. Give me just a second.
Right. Okay, so in the meantime, I guess I already asked before, you guys don't have any trouble with terminology. You know, it's not like a citizen participation. You don't have any trouble with transportation engineering or transit words. So I can go fast because I'd like to cover a lot of material. I'm here to be, what do you call it? Deliver agitprop, I think so. Okay, but it's not based on just hot-headed anger. It's based on substance. I hope you will agree. All right, so.
Oh, it's giving me trouble. My apologies.
All right, well, I guess I can ask one other question while they're waiting too. Anybody seen my textbook? Better Public Transit Systems, just out of curiosity? No? Ugh. See, Routledge, that's also Routledge, Routledge UK, that's where the engineering is. And they do a very poor job of marketing. You're expected to do all your own. But there is a book out there, that one's full of equations, but it is useful. And the idea behind it was, anybody used Professor Vucic's textbook? You know, that's kind of like a Bible, and 2 volumes. Well, he was my advisor. So I wrote a book that fills in the things that he didn't cover about performance and investment analysis. And so if you're interested in those topics, you'll probably find that book is a good supplement to his 2 textbooks. And what's what I'm trying to say here? I'd be lying if I said I was famous, because I'm not. Eric Goldwyn at NYU is working on his transit cost project, and which we all should look at. He had not seen either of my books, or another 3rd book with Preston Schiller. So there just is not good information between us about what resources are out there.
Tim sometimes
What?
brings me out automatically. Why-
Yes, so that I would mention that right now, Eric Goldwyn transit costs, you should really have a look at that. He has got a grant. And he is comparing why do costs in the United States get so much higher than you see in other countries? And why is it taking so much longer? And I saw him a few weeks ago in New York, and I would urge you, like I said, to get in contact with him if you have any questions. Not only will he provide you useful information, he will respond if you ask him questions. Okay, so here we are.
It's not.
Not what?
What I want it to show.
He's showing me, not the,
Yeah, exactly. Try it one more time.
there we go.
There we go.
Okay. We don't need to go over that. So why isn't it moving?
Do you have to click one more time on the
There. Okay, so the outline. Why I wrote this book, original idea was to do an engineering oriented book using systems analysis, how to address multiple problems at once. And I've tried to get funding in both European Union and United States for what you call an optimal urban form model. And I learned a lot just trying to collect the information, and I've tried to share that with several other universities who also have not succeeded. And I'll explain that later. But there's a big issue. There just isn't much interest from elected officials often. And the first half of the book I added later to address the socioeconomic. So I wanted to do engineering analysis. That was my shtick. But I haven't really been able to do that. So now I'm in the policy world. And when I wrote this book, I had to lean on my sister who studied political science. It turned into be very handy. Okay, and other type issues like that. So people from different realms. Okay, and then I added some additional material about other types of transport and competing priorities. Because if you want to try to get transit funded, it has to fit within programs. Okay. Okay, so everybody heard of the dual economy? Anybody familiar with that concept? A lot of economists know that. It just says that you can do the same job with very similar work description, and one of you gets really high pay and good benefits, and the other one has very low pay and no benefits. Okay, so you will see that everywhere, and that really shows up especially in the public sector versus private sector. Okay, and the US is a laggard in infrastructure. That we see all the time, and you see cliches, right, about crumbling infrastructure. Well, it's not really totally true. It's an exaggeration because some people are getting what they want. Okay, proof it's everywhere. Now, if you look at what Biden said a few years ago, he has no empathy for students who are deeply in debt. He goes, give me a break. That's exactly what he said. Now, his own son, Bo, went to University of Pennsylvania, even though he's in Delaware. The University of Pennsylvania, for you West Coasters, it's a private school. It's an Ivy League, very expensive. Not only did he have lots of money, but his son still got to go for free because his father was affiliated, okay, was faculty. Okay, so that's how the system kind of works. And Schumer even said, Democrats are seeking suburban voters. They don't really care about the city dwellers, more likely to use transit. And Biden said no tax increases for anyone under 400,000. Does that sound like the working class to you? No, he's the middle class, upper middle class is part of his base. And if you look at medical costs, they're much higher here, double what they are in Finland in a private hospital. And you can actually, if you're patient, you can get free, if it's not urgent, you can get free care too, okay? So now Cadillac healthcare plans, that comes into transit. I'll talk about that later. Now, 75% of all college faculty are part-time or adjunct in the United States now. So some of them have very good lives, others are struggling. And this is intensifying, I think. Okay, I like this is kind of a joke here in the corner, but it's not really. We'll research for food. Okay, so, okay, now, here's an example of how the system tends to work. The top 0.1%, you invest in the invest in the city council a few $100,000 and you get hundreds of millions of dollars for stadiums back, okay? And then the top 20%, they're the ones who can afford the season tickets. So you see the kind of system you get. And this is Detroit. They were demolishing a perfectly good Joe Louis Arena, you know, as if they didn't have higher priorities, if you've seen Detroit. Okay, and here's parts of Detroit where the car factories used to be, and there's still existing rail lines that served, you know, brought the steel and everything into the plants. But I think there's a misunderstanding of what's going on around the world with something like the car industry. Yes, they did move to Mexico, and they even sold like the entire Saturn plant, which was a very progressive, very lightweight cars, very sellable. My mother had one, they're amazingly efficient, fuel efficient, ahead of their time. They sold the whole factory to China to stop selling them in the United States. But who came in? Japanese and European companies were invited in by the Appalachian Regional Commission. And so the car industry migrated out of the north, not just to Mexico or China, but they're scattered all over Appalachia and the east. And they're there because trucking is non-union. They don't like to use the railroads. And because they get tax breaks and they build in greenfield. So it's really not good for the environment, but there was an official national policy, which most people don't know, to incentivize the European and Japanese companies to locate. Well, the companies also moved out of Detroit. And there was a history after World War II, blacks who were working in the farms, they came up to high paying jobs. Well, guess what? They've now transferred it to the poor whites. They were getting too wealthy, and to lower the costs, they transferred the jobs to Appalachia. So this is okay. This guy, Glenn Weisbrod, he's worth reading. Now this is a typical suburb. This is in Washington, D.C. suburbs where my brother lives. Not very friendly to pedestrians, huh? I used to defy the odds and I'd walk down to the park and ride stop. And there were buses going to the metro only during peak hours. But this is what you're up against in much of the country. Okay, this is very transit hostile. And here. Andy Singer, you've probably seen that one. And there, I did this many times. This is 30th Street Station, like the third busiest train station in the United States. And you have to wait outside. It's hot there in the summer and it can be very cold in the winter. And we have an Americans with Disabilities Act. There's no benches, there's nothing. You have to just stand in the heat or in the rain. Okay, and since I finished the book, they closed the intercity bus station in Philadelphia. Chicago's thinking of closing theirs. Can you imagine? Yeah, but they're upgrading Amtrak. So, I mean, this is, maybe I'm overstressing, but you want to see my point, right? This is the transportation reality of the United States. Okay, and this is an old one. They took it off after I got permission to use this. Awful truth. This is from Michael Moore TV show, 1994. There's a clown waving a taxi and getting immediately ride. There's Yaphet Kotto, the movie star. He stood there for 2 hours and no one would pick him up. Let's even put a sign out, I need a car, and a light was blinking, you know, like no one would pick him up. So the lesson there is Uber filled a gap, right? Uber, that's like what it was in Philadelphia, my neighborhood. They didn't want to come at night, but the Uber would come. So things are complicated. All right. Now this is what the public gets in a lot of cities. This is outside of Milwaukee in the suburbs. They don't make any attempt to increase the transit, but they announce without a vote, we're going to widen the highway. And there, I like this picture because here, does this have a pointer on it? Oh, well, you can see how much space is taken up by that interchange, right? They have to destroy houses to widen these things. But there was no vote on this. All right, here's Seattle, where I grew up. Look at this monster. You know, that's I-5. It's pretty big through here too, but this is even bigger. But look at this thing, and you see it attracts negative uses. When you build these things, no one wants to build residential and no one wants to build housing near these things. So they influence a much bigger part of the city than just the monstrous part. And I had a friend who told me that this is going to be like the Egyptian pyramids in a few thousand years after the apocalypse. We have the nuclear wars or whatever. And there'll be columns left. And everything will be starting to go, what were those columns? They must have been like some kind of religious objects, right? Because they're so giant, you know? And everybody will be wondering what these things were for. Okay, so here's some case studies about big city transit. Portland, I would put us in the middle, okay? And Portland is way above average in the United States, as you probably know, in many ways. But the investment targets reflect the dual economy. And there's so much rail that hasn't been shut down, but it's not being used with full potential. Like I lived in Philadelphia for years, and after I finished at Penn, and if you look at it, it has a magnificent network, which I'll show you, but the headways are so long, they don't get much use out of it. Toronto, my even bigger city, they have pretty poor service. Boston has pretty poor service considering the rail lines that they have. And if they try to build anything, the construction pace is really slow. Now, and most cities, the bus systems are not expanding past population growth rate. Some, they're not even expanding at all. Okay, I could do a whole story about what happened in Montgomery, Alabama. Everybody know about the Rosa Parks case, right? You learn it? Well, what you didn't learn was the segregationists won. Because when 59, they changed the Constitution so that the state cannot build any transit. And they slowly shrunk the system down to zero, kept getting it smaller and smaller, and finally totally exterminated it in 97. It was too small to even be usable. And then in 99, they opened a new system. Okay, so, but the state still gives zero. Okay, but that's a whole other topic. But you should be aware that it does make a difference what part of the region you're in and what size of city you're in. Like a bigger city, transit is at least an issue because so many people live there, okay? But in smaller states with smaller cities, they just get zero. Even Georgia, Atlanta gets approximately zero. Okay. Now, Seattle, everybody heard of forward thrust? Okay, I was a kid back then, but forward thrust was a project where they were going to build rapid transit. The feds had money for 4 cities and they voted it down and the money went to Atlanta to build their system. But it was basically rapid transit, which was not, and with big cars, it wasn't really appropriate for Seattle. It went up to freeway medians and it got voted down. And then they tried again in 73, but it was called Cadillac BART by my friends like Preston Schiller, who I think has spoken here before, a co-author, and they called it that because it was so fancy and it didn't meet the immediate needs. Okay, in 95, there was another project, Tom Madoff, he was here at TriMet. He was an operations officer when they opened the light rail line. He's a real legend in the transit industry. And he made a plan that was very good. They had to vote on it. And it's slightly lost in one county, so they didn't build any of it, but it won in King County where all the population is. Okay, so they didn't build any. And then in 96, the trim down proposal where we removed the Bellevue link, that passed, okay, 1 year later. And the initial segment towards cite Airport was resisted by Port of Seattle. Well, that was a logical place to go, right? Past, there's a huge employment at big airports. And then the freight railroads extracted a lot of money. Things they should have spent money on, they got the government to spend money on expansion for their freight services to allow trains in the peak hours. And then in 2008, they said, okay, we need the East Side Line. And then at much higher expense, it was voted in and put back in again. Okay, there is one positive thing. But Rapid Ride is kind of bus rapid transit like. Fill the higher speed, longer trip segment. It's been very successful. And so you can finally cross the region, not just at the rail line, for a reasonable amount of time. And it would be good to have a speaker, since it's so close, to talk about that. And Route 255, I took to UW in the 70s. I went to University of Washington, mechanical engineering. I started as for US Navy weapon systems and stuff. So anyway, I went there and it's back at half an hour. They cut the service back to half an hour again. And there's thousands of more apartments in Kirkland now where 255 goes. So this is the response we're getting. You got the same services in the 70s when it was mostly low density housing. And now with high-rise apartments, they're not increasing the service. Okay, Northgate Extension of Light Rail Line. 8 miles north of downtown. Remember I was saying 1996, they funded it. It took 25 years to get 8 miles north of downtown. The people who paid for it are long since retired, right? Okay, so you can see that people are going to oppose it often. They're going to go like, I'm never going to get to use it, right? And it shouldn't have taken so long. But again, Tom Madoff was in charge of this project too. And he's retired now, but he would be a great speaker because he will tell you that they could have saved a lot of time and money if they'd done it elevated across the bridge instead of deep underground. Because it takes 5 miles just to get to the surface again at the maximum gradient rail can run. And it would have been done much quicker, much lower cost, but the University of Washington fought it. By the way, University of Minnesota fought the rail line there. University of Maryland fought the rail line through their campus. All because it would shake the laboratories is what they said. Okay, so you can see it's taking a long, long time. And here we are. Everybody heard about the West Seattle project? You know, everybody know what Seattle's like, or West Seattle's on the other side of the harbor? Well, they want to build a tunnel. That's going to take forever. And they need something. Well, these gondolas actually work. They're all over South America now, and they can be built cheaply and quickly. And they're based on ski lift technology. And because there's such big demand, now they're making cars more optimally designed for transit use. And you could actually go across the bay, and it would be a tourist ride too. And this could be built in 2 years. That's from Bogota, as you can see, but they're all over. They started in Medellin in Colombia. Now they're in La Paz. It's perfect in La Paz. It's 10,000 feet up. Diesel engines don't run very well at that altitude, but these are electric. So these are not to be scoffed at, in my opinion, any longer. Now here's Philadelphia. This was a magnificent convention hall and civic center, and this is where Truman was nominated. It's an absolutely magnificent building. And we thought it was protected. Wasn't. You see the arch here? It's a very beautiful building, a very fancy woodwork. And it was torn down because Penn wanted a research center. And the city didn't defend it, you know, which I found kind of surprising. And okay, this is what happened with that big building in the middle there. That's where the center used to be. Look at this is a traffic jam all day during the middle of the day now, because there's a giant university research complex and medical center and hospital, and it's all globbed in. And then they build a one-way couplet and a parking garage for their high-income workers, so they don't have to go on the street. And so they slow down this transit. It goes in the loop. The Route 42 carries over 10,000 people a day. It's a very busy route. It now has to go around the backs of the parking houses in a one-way. And so it's okay to disturb that many people and add several minutes to their journey, and yet they'll build a freeway for a couple minutes savings, but $100 million, right? Because it's the people who count. This in itself would be a good topic, but you get the idea. They were focused only on the complex, the medical complex. They didn't focus on the impact of the region as a whole. And here, this is how big the network. All the black is the regional rail, and the green is the trams. I guess you would call them the trolleys. And you can see the subway lines. Well, this red one here, 16 short side blocks. It's actually very close to the Penn Hospital complex. In any other rich country, except maybe Canada, which was also slow for years, they would have built a small extension. And this would be one of the busiest stops in the entire system. And the buses could have been truncated and people could have gotten fast. And it would have been all around good. Well, the city and the university didn't bring this up. None of them brought this up. And there's tiny little, at the end of the arrows, there's tiny little extensions planned. And most of the system's still at 60-minute headways. All right, now, no expansion since 84. Streetcars are now 40 years old and they're not accessible. That's 33 years after passage of the ADA. And they're finally going to replace them. But it's going to be, they bought 120 from Alstom. But they're not going to be fully replaced until 2030. I don't know what's taking so long. But so these cars will be 50 years old and not accessible 40 years after passage of ADA. And regional rail was deliberately neglected inside the city. They had a really beautiful layout where you had the regional rail could connect to the local transit, right? But they didn't want it. They wanted it segregated. It was commuter rail. And the one good thing is the subway extension in the northeast. This was designed decades ago. And finally, every single mayoral candidate supported it. So finally, there's some interest. Unfortunately, this is one of these mega projects that's going to take many years to build. Okay, but at least for the first time in decades, they're actually talking about transit. And everything's old fashioned there. These are just completely obsolete designs. And here you can see during COVID, there's their regional trains. You see how, remember social distancing? Well, there's the trams that I rode in my community. There was no concern about social distancing for them. Okay, New York quickly here. We see how I'm doing on the time. Okay. Now, New York, you could put a line of Sistine Chapels inside this thing because it's got like this mezzanine running 10-car trains in length. It's not needed. That's their first extensions in decades. And this goes to Hudson Yards, Jacob Javits Center. This is to facilitate the development of all these luxury high rises. Okay, too big. And this is just the atrium to come into the station is quite magnificent. But when you have a city that hasn't built for decades, you shouldn't be spending money on magnificent architecture, right? And you could lay a Sistine Chapel on the side this way, it's that big, you know? You should look at these things when you go over there. Okay, and there's still no common fare system in New Jersey, even though the tunnel from New Jersey in is at capacity. The best thing they could do is run the trains through and just get rid of the distinction, right, to the passengers, have New Jersey Transit and MTA run them together. And that would add a lot of capacity to straight running, but they won't cooperate. And then there's the dollar lands, which serve a lot of the communities that are transit deserts. Even those cities over there have transit deserts, parts of them. And they're not going to add because their labor costs are too high and they're very inefficient because there's not much signal priority. But they could have gotten these guys in, but they don't want to do it. But that's a story in itself. But basically, the benefits and the labor costs for New York City Transit are so high, it's not feasible. And they don't want to give a reduced pay. You don't get paid the same to fly a 737 as a 777, right? But that doesn't pertain in the transit industry. Okay. Transit First is finally a reality at 14th Street. Other than that, there are a few BRT-like expressives. The bicycle lanes was a big success, but the only way they got that built was they were experimental. Otherwise, the EIS would have slowed them down for years. And they filed the EIA retroactively, and they also helped that Bloomberg supported it. And so the mayor was willing to look the other way too. But technically, that's still a problem in many cities. Los Angeles, this is a really big metro area by most standards, 14 million people at least. It opened in 92. My friend Richard Stanger, also Wojciech student, was a beginning director. Boy, he has a lot of stories about that one. But the Red Line subway serving downtown opened in 93, 3.5 miles only. But the extension was supposed to be done fast down Wilshire West. That's where it's extremely congested. Very lot of tall buildings along that corridor, if you know LA. But it's taken forever. It hasn't reached UCLA yet in the West End, if you know how LA is laid out. 30 years, it hasn't reached it yet because things are broken into phases. Okay, and there was a proposition to speed things up, and it needed a 2/3 majority to win in California and a 1/2 to cut taxes, 2/3 to increase taxes. Okay, and when the Republicans were in control, nothing happened. But they had 66.7 was the limit. They had 66.5 or something, and it failed at one of their. But then they got Proposition A or something that passed. And the light rail network is the one mode that's been expanding at a decent pace because it's mostly on the ground and a little bit in tunnels. And But projects are being sped up, but I can assure you, they did the research on this. Why are they worried about the speed? The Olympics are coming. I've looked at all the city council memoranda and all, and they're all concerned about the Olympics, not about the people. Okay. The other interesting, if you look at LA, the rapid transit stations are not where the skyscrapers are. If you look at Toronto, you see the stations, they rise with a, not there often, except in downtown LA because of, you can't build Proposition 13. There's a lot of communities that just, they fight very hard to get densification. Now, Barrie Rapid Transit has a lot of land. They've done a good job. All their parking lots are being converted as fast as they can, except for a few like North Berkeley where the community won't let them. Okay, so, and I should say the extension is coming now to San Jose. It's 90% single family housing. They're gonna have 10-car trains every 10 minutes and they're gonna come to a parking lot for single family housing because they haven't been able to get permission to build high rises with the, so. And possibilities of faster connections, Sepulveda Pass, Sepulveda, however you pronounce it. It's the mountains that where Hollywood Hills are between North Hollywood, the Hollywood to the north and the West End to the south. Well, 405 was widened. It's still a traffic jam. So they said, well, finally going to build rapid transit. Well, that's going to take 20 years. And it's, you have to be deep tunnel too, or else up a steep grade. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. Okay, so maybe a monorail or gondola, because you could build those fast, okay? And people laugh at me for this, because anybody who knows something about Professor Vucic, I'm known as one of his disciples, right? You know, like I'm Peter or whatever, one of his best known. And he always favored what was good in the long term, you know, the high capacity, high quality systems. And I went through my life advocating for those things. And now look what's happening. They're not getting done, and we got to reduce greenhouse gas. So now I'm in favor of gadget bonds. That's what we used to call those things, gadget bonds, right? And like toys. But I'm in favor of those toys because they can be built fast. Then when the subway is finished, you can send the monorail to Okinawa. You know that Okinawa is one big monorail down the whole. They built an entire island of, and the equipment will wear out. They can have this stuff. You can actually take the poles out of the ground and ship them. And you know, I'm now at that point where people ridicule over that and say you're inconsistent, but no, it's just a reality of the time. All right, Amtrak. Northeast Corridor is about the highest economic fares in the world. And they have the high fare train, very high fare train and extremely high fare train alternating. Okay, and they're not doing anything about it. They're buying new cars and they're still gonna have different speeds. And they're never going to reach the speed either. Some to California, maybe, but if you know anything about schedule analysis, you want everything to run at the same speed to maximize the throughput. Okay, and if you did this, you could get a lot of cars off 95. It has no impact right now. It competes with the airlines because the fares are too high. If you haven't seen it already, look at WeGo from France. It's a budget version of the TGV, which was already more reasonable. But they don't have any amenities, you know, like the cafe cars and all, and they don't go into the heart of the city, but you can take like the metro out to one of their stops and they're really cheap. We could do that in the Northeast Corridor if you wanted to take reduction of car use seriously. And Philly, as I mentioned, intercity bus station closed. Now Helsinki, one quick thing here. In '68, they had a joint plan with a US company. And it went out of business shortly thereafter. I'll show you why. Because they still had a functioning democracy. In the United States, remember, a lot of cities couldn't keep the highways out, right? The communities didn't want them, but they didn't have the power to keep them out. Well, in Helsinki, they learned there, the highway department learned that the people still have the power and they stopped it and were angry. Okay, now 10 years, I lived there, 10 tram lines. Some have already been extended. They extend them before the new housing opens as a signal that it's going to be there. Okay, even though they're not getting riders, but it lets people know that when you buy this, it's going to be there. And the trams did lose ridership to bicycles in much of the year, not to cars. And they built a metro extension, but it wouldn't have been justified except for TOD, transit-oriented development. And there was a new regional rail line serving the airport and TOD. It wouldn't have been justified either to the airport, but because they're building housing around it, it penciled out. And I will tell you too, that I lived in Oslo for years. Okay, so you can't find housing there, and you can't find housing in Stockholm, but you can find housing in Helsinki. Okay, they did a very good job. They don't have, my rents are now, my cost of living is substantially lower now in Helsinki than it is here. That never used to be true. Okay, but it's because they planned ahead. They have very good transit, they have very good coverage for the money, the monthly fares, because they made the investments, and they have the housing because they made the investments. So they're not in the same trouble that a lot of cities are here because they didn't make those investments. Okay, and there's a tangential BRT line. It's upgraded to LRT that finally opens 21 October. And people are going to study very closely what travel habits will be. This is something ideal for modelers, you know, before and after, because it's a tangential that cuts through all the inner suburbs, and it should profoundly have an impact on it. All right, so this is where the train, this is where the train station used to be up at the top. You can see this. Can you imagine being an elevated freeway next to the train station, interchange there, and look at the spaghetti there, and an expensive tunnel under the harbor there. People did not want that. Okay. Okay, now Paris, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but Paris, I'd urge you to look at, already had good transit. But it didn't have very good conditions for bicyclists and walkers. There's a lot of car driving, which people are scared in parts of the city. Well, the mayor promised to rapidly put in bicycle lanes and make it safer, and they've done so. And the rail system, there's going to be increases in the tram network, circular automated metro connecting a lot of the suburbs, and then new metro lines about Charles de Gaulle and Orly. Why is that justified? Because those are big airports, especially Charles de Gaulle. There's tens of thousands of employees there. So if you're going to have an airport, they actually, like you have one here, the tram here, and it was early. Most cities fought with their airports, were separate districts, because the airport would like to keep the transit out because it would reduce parking revenues. But it went okay here, if I recall. Okay. And they passed the law in the parliament, no airlines where the TGVs are there. You'll have to use a feeder. The TGV train comes into Charles de Gaulle Airport. So if you're on one of those lines, they said, we don't want you taking the airplane. But the EU is very angry because they're very right-wing on ideology. They're much more concerned about competition than they are about the environment. So they're saying this will give the trains a monopoly. So this is playing out, and other countries in the EU are watching. Okay, and there you can see a line. They have a ring line of the light rail. In addition, now they're building the automated metro underneath it. But you can see it's fairly low budget. If you're willing to take space from cars, you can build these things relatively cheap. The trouble and expense comes in when you have to fight over that, or you have to go elevated. When you have to fight, it's delays, and you don't get the signal priority one. It becomes too slow. Again, doesn't pencil out. But there, you can see the cars. This is during rush hour. I took it. But you can see they understand. They understand, and they don't have an excuse. The only people taking the cars are people who really want to or need to. They're not forced to there, okay? That's the difference. And that's the same in Helsinki, where I live. The transit's pretty good, especially all the way out to the inner suburbs. And if you have a car and driving it, it's because you need it for your work, okay? Now, there's a loop around the middle. There's a new light rail line going out from Orly. The reason for that is there's a lot of workers. The idea is to provide workers with the spots along the line to live. And then there's the rapid transit in, and a new rapid transit up in the corner up to Charles de Gaulle Airport. All of this is going to be done by 2030. So this is one of those big projects that I don't oppose because they're building it fast. Now, observations about transit under a Green New Deal. I think the infrastructure bill is proving to be a disaster. I tend to be negative and say, oh, why don't you wait, Eric? See how it works out. Well, it's working out like that. Transit has to jump through all these hoops. But a lot of cities were ready and a lot of state DOTs were ready. They already have their EISs, environmental impact statements, ready for their highway widenings. And the state paid for it. The state won't pay often for the transit ones, right? You have to find a grant for somewhere. Okay, and temporarily we're now at 20% local match instead of 50. Okay, so now it's even with highways. So now would have been a good time to apply. And I already mentioned about transit hard to fund. Here we go. This is I-405, not in here, but I-405 around Seattle. Widening going on everywhere now. There's a feeding frenzy. And this is a city where they talk green, but you know, it's not in reality. And the buses that go up the side, I know because my brother and sister live in Renton where this was taken. To take the bus to Bellevue a few miles north, they only go every half hour or 1 hour on weekends. And it's only a 10-minute ride once you get on it, you know, so they could easily at least make a BRT along there and get quite a few people maybe out of their cars, but they're not doing that. They don't have the money for that, but there's money for this. Okay, more details. Now, if you look at the big cities, because there's been so little investment, they, meaning the elected officials and the workers, they kind of view it like the street lights and whatever. It's just, you know, sewers. It's just stuff that's there because it never changes hardly. And they become entitled and they think, you know, it's their God-given right to, and like the transit union guys, they view themselves as bus drivers or train drivers or mechanics. They're not part of a team that's on a mission to improve the environment. So they fight technology. Like New York City Transit still has conductors. You don't need conductors on trains anymore. At great expense, they still have conductors. Okay, so it's a political machine. You know, these guys like TWU 100, they endorsed the same candidate as the police did, right? They didn't endorse the green candidate because it's all about being part of this machine because they have extraordinarily expensive benefits and nobody wants to mess with reducing the number of them. You could put them to work doing something else. I'm not going to lay them off, but they still fight. Okay. And the prevailing wage rule is in the infrastructure bill. That means you can't hire locals. So you get people temporarily coming in from unions for a little while to work, but they don't hire the locals. And locals, a lot of their businesses fail if they don't get, you know, compensation for their street disruption. So it makes sense. And we have a severe shortage in a lot of the Western countries, especially US and Canada. UK to some extent, Finland not so much, not Northern Europe, but we've been under training vocational workers. So this would be a good opportunity to bring in more people. You tell the locals whose businesses say, give them first right of first, for example, right? That you guys want to learn a skill. All right. And the other thing, like healthcare is in the transit budget in the United States often. It's not in the budget in other countries, and it's huge. And actually, there's a guy who was the executive director of TriMet. He saw this coming and he resigned over this. He refused. The elected official side goes, look, we're not a healthcare agency. We can't afford this. They're not going to get anything better than what other people get. But he lost. And even today, it's a great expense and limits the amount of service you can provide. It should be one of the values of a national health plan would be to shift the budget of essential services and make it part of your general taxation, okay? So you see what I mean, where, and this is the same thing for a lot of services like pensions. They're portable pensions in a lot of countries. Here, people want to keep their pensions from their agencies, and it's a big burden for the agency, and also makes the person tied in. They can't move because they're afraid of losing it. So we would have a more fluid labor market. And again, it would make transit expansion much faster. Okay. Now, there's many interrelated problems. I'm doing okay. I'm okay. This is under the University Bridge in Seattle. And there you can see homeless people. And there's somebody feeding the geese. This is one of the parks in Seattle. This is what they're like now. Now, we can fix these because housing is connected to transit, right? If you put it into housing, you plan a corridor, you build the housing along the way. So the right way to do this is to do a systems approach, not have separate budgets for all these and have uncoordinated plans. All right, so Summarizing, what is holding back a faster urban development pace? Pandering. The auto industry really been allowed to increase their car size. They're huge now. And I'll take that Saturn that was gasoline powered, or I'll take one of these Toyota Prius any day over these electric monsters, right? That are really big. And pedestrian deaths are going up in the United States because of this too. And there's fires. They're going to have trouble with storing these things. You don't want to store them inside. So, there's a lot of things that are problems that are being caused by overemphasis on technology solutions instead of just putting in transit. We should have been pressuring to make smaller cars. And the leaders often, they don't appreciate or use transit themselves. Like I'd be in favor of city council members not being given parking and require them, give them a transit pass or something, say you can't have parking, you have to experience what your citizens experience, right? Okay, silos, I already talked about that, but they're everywhere. Academia, in the professions, government departments, organized labor. People say that they're this one thing, but they shouldn't be this one thing necessarily, right? And the funding shouldn't be for one hyper specialization. You should make projects that combine and address several problems. And the value of that is that when you do it that way, you find that unintended consequences show up when you study, right? You go, oh, I didn't know this would happen. And so you catch all kinds of potential problems this way, and you can plan your workforce. You go, okay, well, we're going to have the skills are needed for this right now. And then when this phase is down, these skills can be moved to something else. And that's what US and Canada did in World War II. They called it the arsenal of democracy. They were arming not only themselves, but Russia intensely, in Australia and other places, because they were using systems analysis, optimization. They didn't even have the digital computers. These are hard problems to solve. But they would say, okay, we're going to tank production now. We don't need that. We're going to now go to ships, right? And they would plan. It goes, where are the bottlenecks? We need more welders, or we need more riveters. Where's like that Rosie the riveter came from? We need riveters. But they identified that by doing systems analysis. And that's what we should do again. Okay, and universities, infrastructure studies are in silos. Highway studies still persist. Transit is diminishing. And what's really interesting, I ask people who are in the business, they go, they're using this really nice software. And you can do what if analysis really fast now. And they see these curves, they think they discovered something. Oh, no, that's in the textbooks for 100 years ago. It's just that they don't use the books anymore. They don't get taught, but they think they're discovering something new by using the software. So we have a big pedagogical experiment going on. Can we replace teaching with tinkering with software? Maybe they can. Maybe I'm obsolete. You're not obsolete yet, but but maybe you will be, right? Maybe we can learn. Maybe we can learn by software. Okay, what can be done quickly? And then I'm done here. 2 more minutes. I think silos should be dismantled as quickly as possible. Everybody know what TSP means? Transit signal priority. Don't pander to the top 20%. Take those lanes. And you know what? A lot of them will discover that life is better when the non-essential people don't want to drive. It could be better for them. They found that in a lot of cities. Increase capacity of existing tunnels. Don't build this other tunnel downtown Seattle. Here, maybe, because they don't have any, but why would you need to do that? They have communication-based train control. You can run trains at quick frequency, and we don't have years. And resist almost all highway widening. Challenge the EISs and EAs. They're flimsy, a lot of them, because they claim that the pollution will go down, right? Because we don't have standing cars. But what really happens is you induce more traffic. And mobility as a service, which I worked in. These things can actually be made to work if the institutional interest is there. It could force companies to cooperate with one another and give single tickets. And especially resist virtue signaling with like electric buses. Like Tulsa doesn't need electric buses. They have 50 buses in their peak hour. Can you imagine? You can stand in downtown and only see 1 or 2 buses. Do you think the people there would rather have a bus every half hour or every 15 minutes or convert their diesel electric hybrid to all electric? Which would they rather have if you ask them? Okay, so now Toronto's going to be a case study. I think Toronto's really doing this fast. They're finally got some German consulting company and a German railway. And they're gonna put in 10-minute headways on most lines in the peak. They're gonna make it like a European system, and they can do it because they don't have any expensive tunnels to build. So there are role models out there. Finally, these kind of things are like this, a Philadelphia police car. Now, why do they have that thing on the front? So they don't scratch their car? That kills pedestrians or bicyclists. You know, having that thing on the front, the bull bar, that needlessly upgrades a bump or a broken limb into a fatality because it's sharp, right? You get an internal injury. Get rid of those. Who cares if the car gets scratched, you know, right? Or when they have to tow. Or look at this, where my brother lives. There's a gate there. Where's the pedestrian path? I walk from the store up this hill. I have to go in that grass. Wait till you see how slippery that is when it rains. Okay. So, and one last thing, the money's going to AVs. And this is a curve I simplified from Frederick Lader's analysis. The optimal speed for maximizing throughput goes down with the size of the vehicle. So to get these throughputs they're claiming with cars, you have to go slower. The New York City transit speed is 55 miles an hour. It's a 10-car train. The maximum speed for a PRT, personal rapid transit car, is down at like 12 miles an hour because all the space is consumed by the braking distance, you see? So it's counterintuitive. And that's why AVs cannot replace transit. But people don't know that. Okay, that's it. We have 10 minutes left. Perfect. Okay. And that's me standing under that's the metro car in Helsinki. Helsinki's, by the way, 1.3 million people, same as out here, maybe a little smaller. And it has per capita 300 transit trips a year. Here, what is it? 60? What? 60 or 7? Yeah, 300. It's not even in the same, but that's why you could cover 50% operating costs. I pay 70 euros a month for zone A and B, city and inner suburbs with excellent service, and it covers 50% of the cost. If you go to Seattle area, you pay 100 and it covers 20% of the cost because they didn't make the investments to make an efficient system in the past. All right, I talked too much. Questions?
I have a question about going back to Seattle. You recommended gondolas and monorails. I went to undergrad at UW, and I remember, and this was the early 2000s, and granted I wasn't studying transportation or engineering or anything of the like, but I remember on my ballot seeing monorail, and it seemed very inefficient, rather than just putting it on the street as like a street.
Well, yeah, that's not,
explain why.
but that's not the same case. In Seattle, they were doing it to avoid taking lanes from cars. The corridors they were going to put in were relatively flat. The Sepulveda Pass is very special case because it's a mountain, right? If you know Hollywood Hills, they're small mountains is what they are, and it's steep. And the monorail can climb very steep hills, and they have a very urgent need. Whereas in Seattle, it's all about avoiding taking cars. Like if you know where the Fremont district is, there should be a streetcar to Ballard decades ago. They don't need a tunnel to Ballard. They just don't want to take lanes from Fremont Avenue. So I'm not saying
Concern like the political challenge of taking the lanes. It's not that it's
exactly
from an engineering standpoint.
exactly, and they already have electric trolleys which climb steep hills. There's a reason why Vancouver and Seattle and San Francisco all had trolley buses. They all have steep hills and they all had city or provincial owned utilities. So this is nothing new. The electric, they can climb hills really fast with the electric power. They were an ideal, and they can brake with them. They were ideal for that because of the hills. But the corridors where the monorail was going to go was not up those hills. That would not still not make sense because the capacity need isn't so high. LA, Sepulveda Pass, you would fill up everything they put there. I think the I-405 in that crew in LA is about one of the busiest highways in the United States. I think the 410 in Toronto is the busiest in North America, something like that. But the I-405 is not in the same league, but that was a good question. Okay, so.
Oh, so you mentioned that Toronto is doing great work and could serve as a blueprint for US.
Well, only because it just passed. Yeah, it hasn't played out yet, but based on their plans, they've conceded defeat. And I'm sure there was a lot of bitter complaints from US consult and Canadian consulting companies because there's a lot of them. But they said, no, you got to work with these guys because we want to make sure we use somebody who knows what they're doing and have done it. But I can't promise it's going to happen.
Is there to add on to that question, based on the research you've done, is there a US city that's most primed to kind of follow in the footsteps of Toronto?
Well, I'm blanking right now, but I'm sure there are. I would have said LA because they were building all these BRT lines. But from what I understand is they're not enforcing the speed restrictions on cars and they're not running the transit signal priority and they haven't really followed through. They've reversed some of their upgrades but LA was trying to build like multiple BRT corridors, as you know, right? They were trying really hard, but they're not able to sustain the performance they were hoping. Chicago, no. Chicago, they're one of the few places that's got the 80% match. They're the only big city I've seen so far. And no, it wasn't Chicago, it was LA got the 80% because they applied. Chicago should have got the 80%. They're now getting 50% for the red line, but because they applied too soon. Can you imagine? What the government should have did was, okay, you applied early for a reward, we're going to give you extra, right? But instead they're getting penalized for applying early. And so they're trying, Chicago's trying sort of to build transit finally, but then they're closing the inner city. So it's mixed. And New York City transit, yeah, they've got a new, what do you call it, tangential corridor in Brooklyn, and they want to build it fast, but they don't have their act together. They've got to hurry to apply for the 80% match. And I don't see the paperwork coming. You see what I mean? It's like you have to distinguish between the talk and the reality. And several are talking a good game right now. But I would say there's some smaller cities like Madison, Wisconsin. It's a university town, of course. But they rushed through a bus rapid transit corridor. I'm impressed that they're doing it. And I think these rapid rides here in the Northwest, you have a couple of corridors that are not so bad here, right? You're doing okay here. But I would say there's no super standout. Do you have any super standouts?
I was gonna say LA, not Seattle.
Well, the rapid rides, yes. But even there, if you go through Shoreline, for example, the city north of, they didn't want to participate in the signal priority. So you go fast and they go, wait a minute, we can't finish this unless you cooperate with us. And so, you know, it helps to have regional government, which you have around here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Minneapolis, I'll say Minneapolis is trying really hard. I will say Minneapolis did a big increase in transit budget and they face a lot of criticism for ignoring their lower income corridors, and they're trying really hard all of a sudden, and their last legislature gave a huge increase. So that's the one I would say right now in Minneapolis. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've heard some people say that one of the big reasons why transit costs are so much greater here and why projects take a lot longer is that in Europe, they have more capacity to do a lot of their planning in-house, whereas here we have to rely more heavily on consulting firms. Have you found?
Yeah, well,
anything about that?
I know a little bit about that. Eric Goldwood has studied that, the guy I mentioned at the beginning, in great detail, but yeah. If you shut down and start up all the time and you have like intermittent projects, you lose the expertise in-house. Whereas like Helsinki, they're always improving the system. They hire consultants for the additional, but they have a competence in-house because they're always doing something. So if you have a city where you're not doing something and all of a sudden you need to, then you get in trouble. Like Sound Transit got in trouble because it hadn't built for decades, right? So yeah, that could be a factor, but it's only relevant if you're doing a lot. You can't afford to have a staff, planning and designing staff twiddling their thumbs when you're not planning and designing anything, you know? So, but again, if you're interested, please look at Eric Goldwyn for that. Yeah. And I will say one other thing, operating cost. I won't say that the operating and maintenance costs are not a big factor, that are much higher. You have to distinguish them from capital. It can be quite a bit higher in the United States for the reason I mentioned, which limits the amount of service that you can offer because the overhead is so high. But on capital costs, Canada also has very high, like Toronto has also had extremely high construction costs, and they don't have that medical, an overhead benefit problem. But they have other problems, which is they have a lack of workforce. Okay, they've also neglected their staff. So I think a lot of the key is to train more people in vocational schools because these people are in demand, right? And you have to slow projects down to match your workforce capabilities.
Questions online, but should we wrap up or what?
We're after.
Okay, we're at time.
30, yeah.
No questions online?
Thanks. I think we should wrap up here.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
But I think you can find, everybody knows how to find things fast. So